Is the video still going?
Yeah, it is now.
Is the video still going?
Yeah, it is now.
So it's 12 o'clock now in Pacific Standard Time. So if we can just wait for the right now, we can wait and then we'll get started. So it's 12 o'clock now in Pacific Standard Time. So if we can It seems like we're waiting for one more person who just got on. And we're just there we go. All right. Awesome. So we can get started in waiting for one more person. 2 minutes. Just everyone have a little bit of patience. Get started in waiting for one more person. 2 minutes. Just everyone have a little bit of patience. So what's up, everyone? Can y'all hear me? Is that echo still there? No? Cool. All right, so you all have the ability to unmute and mute yourselves. So if when folks are not answering a question, if you could just, mute yourself and unmute, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So it's 12:10 here in rainy Los Angeles, and it's cold, so I'm wearing a jacket. But how are you all? How's everyone?
Doing well.
Good. Also cold. It was snowing here this morning, I regret to inform you.
Yeah, that sucks. I like the snow.
In Philly, there was a sprinkle of snow too, and it's really warm right now.
Cool. All right. So welcome everyone. This is the first of many live streams that we hope to have, right? So good afternoon to everyone tuning in as well, right? So it's great to be with everyone. And my name is Cesar, and I'm a member of the Black Rosa Anarchist Federation, the Federación Anarquista Rosa Negra, and I'm a working artist living in Los Angeles, California. I'm a tenant and I support the rent strike. So today's panel is titled Tenant Power in the Time of COVID-19. It'll be the first panel in our quarantine live stream series. So for more information on upcoming panels, you can find us online at www.blackrosefed.org. And make sure to like and subscribe and share us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. For those of you who are watching the live stream on YouTube, you could always subscribe to that. And if you're interested in more audio content, then you can subscribe to the From Below podcast, which is a project by members of Black Rose Rosa Negra. So with us today are 4 tenant organizers from across the United States, each involved in tenant unions in their respective cities. Tenant unions, much like traditional labor unions, are groups of neighbors coming together to build their collective power in their living spaces. So this includes the unhoused, and it includes people who move from place to place. As an organization, we believe that we're not organizing the people, but we are the people organized. And we also believe that for those of us who come from marginalized groups, no one will come to save us, and we are the leaders we've been waiting for, right? And so without further ado, I'd like to now introduce our panelists who are all, displayed right on top of my laptop right now. So the first person I would like to introduce is Patrick. Patrick works and organizes in the state of Vermont with the Burlington Tenants Union and the Black Rosa Anarchist Federation. So welcome, Patrick. Next, we have Justin. So Justin lives in Oakland, California. He's an organizing steward for Tenant and Neighborhood Council's West Oakland Local. Welcome, Justin. Locally here in LA, we have Chrysanthi. Chrysanthi lives in Los Angeles. She organizes with the Vermont Beverly chapter of the LA Tenants Union. So welcome, Chrysanthi. And our final panelist, last but not least, Mara is a Spanish interpreter and mother of three. She's a co-chair of Philly Socialist, a local grassroots socialist organization in Philadelphia. She is also the co-founder of the Philly Tenants Union, of which she is a base building member. So welcome, everyone. How is everyone?
We're good.
Pretty good, yeah. Thanks for having me.
For sure. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being on this panel. And I guess we'll just go ahead and start with the questions, right? So the way that this panel is going to work is that there's three main questions that we have that participants have been able to get a chance to look over. At the end of the initial three questions, what we're going to do is there an echo still happening? Or was that a chat from earlier?
Sounds fine here.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, thanks.
So once again, so after the panel, the initial three questions, what we're gonna do is we're just gonna have some questions from the audience. So when people signed into the Zoom webinar, they were able to ask questions. So some of those questions are kind of already in the initial three questions, but the ones that we think are a little bit more like need more attention, that's what we're gonna be asking at the end, right? So yeah, I guess we can start now, right? So for the first question, there are plenty of handbooks that are floating around the internet with tips on how to start a tenant union, but we recognize that organizing a tenant union in LA will probably look different than starting a tenant union somewhere like Burlington, Vermont. Given these regional differences, what brought you to tenant organizing, and what was it like starting a tenant union or joining an existing formation? So I guess we'll start with Mr. Patrick from Burlington, Vermont.
Sure. So I think I could be confident in saying that I'm representing the smallest city of all the panelists. The size of our city, which is around 40,000 people, probably qualifies as a neighborhood for the rest of y'all. And as someone who's lived in DC and Boston, I came to Burlington when I moved here several years ago with sort of that mindset, but it's a very different landscape. There's some unique aspects to it. There are a lot more landlords that own only one or two or three units. So there's a lot of decentralization, which can make organizing difficult. There's also a fair amount of concentration too. So we've been looking at the total holdings of landlords across the city. And oftentimes we're finding these landlords also have properties far afield as well elsewhere in Vermont. But in terms of Burlington, 27 landlords own more than half of all the housing units in the city. That's about a little more than $1 billion worth of property. But because it's of the nature of the housing stock, often, a lot of these properties are 1 and 2 family homes. It can be very difficult to tell just at first glance who owns what. So unlike in DC or Boston, where it was really easy to find gigantic apartment buildings that it was very easy to tell both who owned it and who managed the property. With this, it was a lot more difficult. It required a lot more canvassing. The Burlington Tenants Union started officially last year, but a lot of us had been sort of organizing toward one for several years before that. The political landscape, this is the home of Bernie Sanders, right? Unlike Bernie, our current mayor is now Miro Weinberger, who's a developer by trade. So we have someone in the city hall that's very much attuned to the interests of developers and landlords. So while a progressive city of sorts, the few protections we do have for tenants are often not enforced. The tenants often don't know about them. And when they try to exercise those rights, it really comes down to, no surprise, that it's whether or not you're organized that you can actually assert and claim these rights and these protections. So what we've been trying to do is especially in this current crisis, get people together and through Zoom calls like this, and I know we'll talk about this in a later question, reach out to people and try to connect disparate folks who may not know, they have the same landlord. This is an incredibly tight rental market, largely due to it being a huge college town. University of Vermont's here, Champlain College, St. Mike's right next door. So the institutional landlords are also playing a pretty huge role, both in terms of pushing rents up, but also in terms of dictating public policy in City Hall. So we've noticed here that tenant organizing also looks like student organizing, because students are, through their on-campus and off-campus rentals, really being abused and having rents hiked on them with very little recourse because they're so transient. So that's sort of just a few of the things we're dealing with here.
Thank you for that, Patrick. I guess this question, I want Mara, if you could answer. Well, since you are one of the co-founders of the Philly Tenants Union, right? I wanted to figure out, like, what was that experience like for you to help to found one of these unions that's doing this important work?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, so I think that so originally I've been a member of the Philly Socialists, which is like a local nonprofit political organization. And at the time, 5 years ago, we do what in Philly Socialists we have what's called like projects, or kind of like base building work, which is like things around like ways that we organize kind of like working class people around different issues. And then at the time we had found the Seattle Solidarity Network kind of like a guide that they had put out, and we decided to copy that. And it was basically around like, do you have a bad boss, or do you have like a bad have to deal with a slumlord, contact us. And it was like kind of around like maybe just trying to pick up small fights to kind of get people's like maybe like secure deposits back, or small things that where we could like reach out to kind of like working class people. But it turns out that when we started putting all these posters, and the main concerns that we were getting was people that were having like bad tenants. Sorry if there is a lot of noise in the room, because I'm sharing the room with my 3 kids, my husband who's also on another call. So let me just move to another corner. So yeah, we were getting a lot of calls, people complaining about their tenants, their landlords and stuff. And we started kind of picking up all the fights that we were picking up were just like bad, against slumlords. And then we started kind of like, then we decided, okay, let's just focus, because we were like, at the time we were like, we're not like a large organization now, but we were a lot smaller. So we were like, okay, let's just focus on tenants. And we decided to only focus on tenants. And then we, for like a whole year, we just did a ton, like several small fights. A lot of them didn't go anywhere. Some of them, we won security deposits, whatever. And then we started making connections with other tenants in Philly. That's what we call it, like, that's why we like try to go for this like base building ideology, where just basically you build a base of like people around a certain issue outside of like your regular leftist politics. So yeah, we made enough tenants, and we had a convention where we decided, and the tenants actually decided that they wanted to create like a tenants union, something that was like more permanent. And then we launched the tenants union, and then we decided to do, what would a union do? So obviously union fights for rights of a certain type of person, or like, around certain issues, and also continue with the same fights that we were doing when we were just a Solidarity Network. So the situation in Philly is like very kind of like, Philly is like an interesting place because we do have a lot of rentals. Like a lot of people, I think most of the people who live in Philly are like, they rent their homes. But we also are like maybe not as advanced as like say LA or like New York, but we have like a pretty large like problem. We have a pretty big problem with gentrification, and there is a lot of kind of like land issues and a lot of like sketchy things that the city council do, and there's all this like because like Philly is not as big as New York City, it's like a lot smaller, but we're very dense, right? So we have like we could see the trajectory of like, all right, so we obviously are a popular city where people are coming from New York because it's cheaper, and we're close enough that they could probably travel to work in New York but live in Philly. So we were like noticing the trajectory of like housing going up, and like the price of housing going up, and with that rental, and also like the homelessness level was going up as well, right? So we one of our first kind of like citywide fights was the just cause or good cause, which is like well, actually we wanted to do rent control, but we decided to scale it back to just cause, which basically means that the landlord has to give a, a just or a good cause for a tenant to be evicted, and then that will be like a step one to then move into rent control, which is the campaign that we have now. So my experience as a renter in Philly is like basically you just have no rights, and also we have no anybody who represents anybody like us. There is no profits that like pair you up with like a lawyer after you already are being evicted or something like that, but nothing before, you know. And we decided to be that kind of that body, and we've met a lot of tenants, who basically that's their main issue is that they're always being a tenant, and they have faced, they're always like the threat of like homelessness like on your shoulder. It just doesn't even matter if you like are like middle class or working class or something. That's like you're like a paycheck away from being homeless, especially people who are like, it is obviously this affects mostly kind of like immigrants and black people who are like the majority of like in Philly. I mean, at least in the metropolitan, like the more kind of dense areas, is mostly kind of people of color, which is like, and when I'm talking about gentrification, obviously, like the city has this excuse that like, oh, we want to make the city better, so we want to bring all this like new people, aka white people. Nothing against white people, but you know what I mean. Like that's what they mean, right? They want to kind of like change the culture of the city, and then so it's like that, so I don't know if you had like any other more. I don't know if that answered your question at all. I hope
Yeah,
so.
definitely. It's a lot of good context because I have no real idea of what's going on in Philadelphia. And so it's always good to see what's happening all across the board, right? Thank you for that. I guess the same question, I want to start with Justin, and then we'll come back down to LA and with Chrysanthi. So, Justin, what are your thoughts on this first question?
Yeah. Thanks for having me. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about the Bay Area context, and then I'll talk about the history of Tank. So I'm in Oakland, and Tank operates like kind of in the wider Bay Area now. So Oakland is the situation here is basically such that there's like a lot of renters, the high density of renters, because the price of buying a home here is extremely expensive, mostly due to our proximity to San Francisco, and the explosion of the tech industry, and just the general tendency of like urban gentrification and displacement has made rents also skyrocket alongside the cost of like buying a home. So there's kind of a generational disparity in some cases here where older working class people might own a home, but in terms of the younger generation or people who were cleaned out by the 2008 financial crisis, those people are by and large renters or tenants. So that's kind of the general lay of the land here. And I'd say Oakland's experiencing an acute housing crisis. And there's lots of people that try to explain what that crisis is all about. Our view is that the crisis is really about the sort of like way the system is structured. the way housing is allocated, the conditions under which it is produced. So there is a lot of like YIMBY stuff that we get here, which tries to portray the issue as one of a simple equation of supply and demand, which I think is pretty easy to refute on just any basic level. It's a particularly obvious when you look at the explosion of housing here. I mean, sorry, the explosion of homelessness here, and the level of like vacancies that exists in luxury condos and new developments, and also in older buildings. And this has everything to do with like finance and speculation on the home, because the more tenants you have in a place, and the more rights those tenants have, the less value your property has if you want to sell it. So as one example, like my landlord is trying to sell our home right now. And the price of this home would go up quite a bit if she can get rid of one of the tenants and have a vacancy. So there's this kind of situation where there's a lot of stuff at play. There's like finance, capital, and speculation happening. There's like an explosion of homelessness and sort of like homeless encampments. There's all sorts of new developments with a lot of money being poured into these really ugly condos with high vacancies and extremely unaffordable rents. And, you know, this kind of maps onto the sort of labor market. There's lots of people who are sort of working service jobs, nonprofit jobs, even like professions like teaching, stuff like this, which were traditionally white collar, have been sort of like pushed down the class ladder in terms of people in tech and sort of finance who are kind of like making big, who can afford the rents, all this kind of. So that's kind of the general situation that we're in. And so the contradictions are pretty obvious. Yeah, hopefully my internet is working. Everyone's stalled out. I suppose I'll just.
Yeah, we can still hear you. It kind of lags a bit, but
yeah. So
good.
Okay. I'll just keep talking then. Yeah. That's the general situation. And then with Tank, I was one of the founding members for Tank, and basically it came out of a DSA adjacent project. So I'm part of this caucus called Communist Caucus, and a while ago we wanted to try to do some more like on the ground material organizing. So kind of a similar story, maybe Philly socialists in a funny way. And so all of us kind of like got together and sort of did some self-assessment, like what are the issues all of us are dealing with that we ourselves, like working class people, are embroiled in. And the most obvious one was like the housing market and rent. So we sort of like focused on that and meditated on it. And as it turns out, my landlord is like a notorious slumlord who, for a variety of reasons, is just kind of like an excessive example of the situation. Someone who shows up at your house at 12 at night, goes through your trash cans, you know, harasses people, is racist. I mean, the list goes on, you know, kind of a classic slumlord. She calls herself a small landlord, but she owns 40 properties. And to give you context, the average cost or price of those properties is probably 1.5 million at least. So this is someone with a tremendous amount of assets. And she got acquired most of them during the housing crisis. So it's probably a wealth transfer from probably mostly black and brown people to this landlord. So she was kind of a good starting place. So we just decided to organize around her. We organized, I'd say like 35 out of the 41 properties that she owned. And the long story short is we made a demand about subtenant replacements, which was a big issue. What the particular of that is that she would basically make it impossible to fill a vacancy in your house. And so that's an effective rent increase for all the other tenants because you're covering that room. It's this tricky way to get around our local rent ordinance here. So we like pushed her on that, and she immediately sort of like gave us what we wanted. And so that was like a great boost for us as a group. And we're like, well, you know, maybe we need to start a tenant union and like expand this effort to other landlords and other tenants. And so that's where Tank was kind of born. And we've been working really hard to like build Tank into a real organization. And also to try to sort of let go of the reins as a political group and allow it to be tenant run, which I think we've made tremendous strides in. And so we just had a leadership election, and a majority of the people are like newer members or whatever, which is great. So now we have Tank, and because of the geography of the Bay Area, we decided to follow the LA Tenants Union model. So we have locals. I'm in the West Oakland local, probably the biggest one that we have, but we just started one in San Francisco. We have a couple more in Oakland, and we're trying to have both like local organizing, but also connect all of them and make sure stuff isn't siloed, just because of the geography and because of the fact that our enemies are extremely well organized, and I think it would be incorrect for us to have a totally decentralized sort of situation given their centralization. So we're trying to strike a balance, and you know that's always a difficult thing, but I think it's been pretty successful so far. Yeah, hopefully that kind of answers the question.
Thank you so much. So now if we can go towards home, LA, Christianity, the same question. What are some of the ways, I guess, what brought you to tenant organizing? What was that experience like, being part of LATU, Los Angeles Tenants Union, which is, I would say, one of the biggest tenants unions there is right now, right? So what's that experience like for you, Christianity?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for having me. Honored to be on a panel with all of you. So just to give a little bit of the landscape of Los Angeles, I would echo what Justin was saying about Oakland, just on a wider scale. We have a lot of our tenants paying over 50% of their paycheck on rent. And even before this crisis, we still had so many people struggling to make their rent every month, even if they are working jobs, service jobs, other jobs, because the housing market has gone up so much. You know, and the same thing here, where we have an enormous crisis with homelessness, but we have a higher vacancy rate of vacant apartments in the city than there are people who are homeless. So we can see that there's these contradictions that go against the YIMBY narrative, or and that really support our understanding that housing is a human right. So the LA Tenants Union started in 2015, and by the time I joined in 2017, there were 3 local chapters. 3 years later, we now have 12 local chapters, and each chapter meets twice a month. The way our meetings work is we start with tenants in crisis. So instead of separating those tenants into their own individual meetings, we ask them to share with the group and tell us what's been happening. And then we'll take some time to brainstorm and share our strategies. And, you know, it'll be like, my landlord is harassing me because I've lived there so long and I pay below market rate. Well, there are people in this room who have been in the same position, and then there's people who may not be there now, but they may be in the future, and their friends or families might experience this. So we think it's important to share this knowledge together. And, you know, we've gone back and forth if that's the best way to do it, but I do think it's an interesting model for welcoming people, making them feel like they're part of a community or part of a movement. So when I joined, I'd been involved with running a DIY event space out of our house. It was called Gal Palace. But this question was coming up, like, how can we ethically do this and not contribute to gentrification? And the answer was we couldn't, and that event space is no longer running, but those questions are definitely what drove me into tenant organizing. I'm a tenant. The only way I can afford a 1-bedroom in central LA is because I live with my partner and we have rent control. So there was something like immediate, and the fact that I had capacity to help organize as well is what drove me. And then, in one of my first meetings of the Tenants Union, I was presented with this definition that they had come up with, which is that gentrification is the replacement and the displacement of the poor for profit. And I just thought that was such a great way to counter anything like, oh, but I like the new minimalist coffee shop in the neighborhood. But, really it just tells you, like, who is that for? How is it impacting the people who live here, who make this neighborhood what it is? So one thing that I joined kind of early on was we had a solidarity casework hotline. And this was a way that people who had immediate issues could call and be redirected to the local chapter that was closest to them, and also give some advice as well. And, people would call in and say, I'm being harassed, my slumlord will not fix anything. And, at the beginning, sometimes I didn't even know the answer, but the value was just being there to listen and letting them know that they're not alone. Especially we would hear things like, oh, I've called nonprofits, I've called lawyers, nobody will help me. You're the first organization that actually took the time to listen to my story as well. And so in the first draft, because I have notes here, because I like having notes, but in my first draft of writing notes, I was like, but let me get back to the organizing part. And I just looked at that like, what am I talking about? This is the organizing, like letting people they're not alone, directing them to a movement of people in their neighborhood fighting the same things. Like that is the building block of what we're doing here. And when you see the guides that come out of the Philly Tenants Union and Tank, I think that specifically the guides that have responded to this crisis, I really appreciate that they're letting people know that there are steps. You want to build those relationships first. Yes, we're in a crisis. Yes, it's emergency and it feels like we need to rush things, but we have to start with the building block of building relationships, building that trust, letting people know that we're there for them, that this is a movement for them, by them. And that is going to take time. So a little bit more about the structure of LA Tenants Union. Every local chapter is autonomous. I'm part of the Vermont Beverly chapter, which is a chunk of central Los Angeles. And the way it's kind of worked out for us is if tenants from a building come to our meeting and let's say the landlord just sold our building and the new one is harassing us to leave so they can raise the rent. So some of our organizers will come there and do a tenants' rights workshop. And in that workshop, we'll explain what a tenant association is, which is a union within one building, or it could be a union in just one building. There's also could be a tenant union of tenants who all have the same landlord across different buildings. But anyway, we explain what a tenant association is, and then if they're interested, we help them form that tenant association. And then we support whatever actions that those tenants want to take. And it could be as small as let's all coordinate and send in our complaints to the housing department, or it could be as big as let's show up to the Beverly Hills restaurant of this landlord and let the media know they're evicting families. Or let's withhold our rent and go on rent strike because these tenants are not going to pay for ridiculous rent increases when they're living in slumlord conditions. And I think that we've been able to ramp up to those because we have been around for 5 years and have been able to start from the first step of building those relationships, starting small and building outward. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, and because you mentioned it, Cesar, is that we've expanded our definition of a tenant to be anyone who doesn't have control over their housing. So we are trying to work more with unhoused tenants. And they're at risk of constant eviction in the forms of sweeps. And we're known for having a crisis around homelessness, which is why it's a great thing we're hosting the Olympics. But yeah, we definitely have a lot of work to do on that front. Certain local chapters are leading the way, but I think that's going to be a really important framework for moving forward.
Thanks so much. It seems like there's so many different ways that people came about this, right? But at the end of the day, like the number one thing that people wanted to do was create a concrete organization, right, in which people could, work towards changing their material, conditions and stuff like that, right? Um, I think one of the questions that comes up, right, is folks have been saying how, before the pandemic, how people were organizing and doing door knocking and stuff like that, right? So like prior to the pandemic, organizers were able to meet in person, reach out to their neighbors, right? Using flyers, going door to door, et cetera, right? But, and despite many cities and states issuing stay-at-home orders, right? We're seeing an increase of tenant union membership, particularly in places like Los Angeles, where the LA Tenants Union has doubled its dues paying membership. So how has the pandemic changed the way in which tenants are organizing, and how are organizers adapting to these challenges? To answer this question, I would like to hear from Mara.
Love this
So I think that
endless, cross-referencing.
I think I don't think that this is easy something to answer for people who are maybe starting out the totally new tenant organization and they have no sorry. It would be very difficult, but I think that since in Philly the Tenants Union has like has already like a name, not like a name, it's like popular, like it's known, right? Like people know about the Tenants Union. We're getting people just contacting us all the time, sending emails, going to the Facebook page and all that stuff. But I think that something that we're trying to adapt is like how are we not meeting in person. It's like obviously we're doing like all this like Zoom meetings and stuff, but also some the current leadership is like doing a pretty good job about having like weekly meetings, like weekly trainings where new tenants who are coming in through either the Facebook or the email or something like that, they are like being trained how to like kind of like what Chris was talking about from LATU, about having like a little tenants rights, and then also going through the guide about how to organize tenants and stuff. And another thing also that I think we're doing is since like the Philly Tenants Union is like a sister organization of Philly Socialists, where we are currently running like a mutual aid program, because a lot of people have lost their jobs and all that situation, right? All of those contacts that we're getting through the mutual aid are getting funneled to like the Tenants Union or towards like this training and stuff. That's like, but that's because we already have a structure in place where we can do things like that. And I am not saying that this is perfect. We're still trying to figure it out, because then there is a challenge to people who might not have internet access, right? And there's people who might not have like computer available to them, or even just going into Zoom or Facebook or anything like that it's just a challenge because they are not like technology people. You see what I'm talking about. Like there's all sorts of and for that I think that we're trying to do kind of like encouraging people to write like a letter to their other tenants, since we can't really see each other, and like drop them off at their place, or like if it's an apartment building, just like drop it off at each one of the doors or something. Or like for instance, my landlord has like properties scattered all over the neighborhood, so I wrote letters and I backed around and dropped them off at different places, and then kind of with the information to get back to us or to me, and then we can organize that way. It's a little bit more challenging. You could probably still do some flyering. How many people are gonna see that? I'm not really sure. So what we're really trying is like encourage people who want to organize other tenants and kind of walk them through the steps of how to reach out to tenants. In Philly, and I'm not sure in other cities, it's public records how many properties your landlord owns. So you can literally go onto the website, and then type the landlord's name or your own address and find the owner and all the properties that the owner owns, and then that's like the information that we give out and how to like walk through all that. And so yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's really important that we're adapting to this whole pandemic, and we're trying to figure out different ways of organizing. Right. I want to hear right now from Justin if you could tell us a little bit about what has that looked like to be able to do what y'all have already been doing under these circumstances.
Yeah, so there's kind of like 2 or 3 operations really happening. One is like, I guess, what you could call outreach. And so that's all about like, okay, how do we get in touch with tenants who have not been in touch with any organization, may not know that they have rights under the moratoriums passed in their municipalities, who have been affected by the crisis or who want to stand in solidarity. Like, how do we find them? So that process for us has been basically sort of oriented at poster distribution. So we came up with a way to sort of like safely distribute posters to anyone in Tank or outside of Tank who would like to go put them up. And so we've been targeting mostly like places in front of essential services, social services, stuff like this. Really being intentional about where we put up that propaganda. And that's been pretty successful. We've gotten quite a few members just from that, and lots of people sign our interest form, which I'll talk about in a second from that method. The other thing that we were doing is really trying to outreach people who have been laid off. What I've noticed, or I guess what we've noticed, is that the most effective way to do that is to have really hyper-targeted things to say to certain kinds of people who have been affected by the crisis. So one of our most successful flyers and like pushes has been to target service workers in particular. So we made a service worker specific flyer that we promoted, and every sort of service worker who has come to Tank, we try to ask them to send that flyer to all their coworkers who also have been laid off. Because, if you work in the restaurant industry or the service industry, you usually have pretty good bonds with your coworkers. So we've been really trying to use those already existing bonds to expand our outreach. And then, so that's been kind of the outreach part. And then, so once we get someone from who was not organized, who didn't know any organizations, to try to get in touch with us, we try to direct them to an interest form that we set up, which is on our website, baytank.com/suspendrent. So on that website, there's like a really short little explanation that says like, we need rent suspension and we need rent forgiveness for anyone who's been affected by the crisis. Seems like a very minimal ask, in my opinion, given the situation. And so at the bottom of the page, there's just a really simple interest form. So instead of trying to get people to automatically sign up for Tank, which is kind of a big ask, like, okay, become a dues paying member, we're kind of like lowering the bar a little bit and allowing people just to sign this interest form to get more information. And so when they sign that, they automatically get sent our organizing guide, which is also public, but it's just easy. It's like, it's more feels more intentional to also get it emailed in addition to having it just out in the ether. So they get emailed that. They also get more information about Tank and our sort of like theory of power and how we're looking at things. And then someone in our organizing committee. So our structure is kind of like LA Tenants Union in that we have a bunch of locals, but we also have some central committees where people collaborate together, one of which is the organizing committee. And the organizer committee has been outreaching all the people who fill out our interest form, sending them texts, giving them a phone call, trying to schedule a one-on-one conversation, inviting them to the next like sort of event or whatever, stuff like this, trying to get them integrated and organized. And so that's kind of brings us to the third step. So we've outreached someone, they've like filled out the interest form. We tried to get in touch, and then after we get in touch with them and they're interested in organizing or expressing some concern about their situation, we'll sort of like try to give them the tools and support necessary to organize around whatever their situation is. So we'll try to get them to sign up as a member, put them in a local, look up their landlord information. We have like a little research team and like an easy link to like request looking up your landlord. So the people will submit that request. We're pretty prompt and we'll get that information to them. And then we'll try to connect them with other people who rent from the same landlord, who may be in our database or whatever. And then the nitty gritty of organizing, we've really been relying on like building posters, like putting pre-made posters up in common spaces. It could be like, you know, the mailbox area or where the, I don't know, laundry is or whatever. In bigger buildings, we've usually told tenants that they should slip notes under the doors or tape them on the doors of people's units. And we have like a print shop in Tank, so we also just kind of provide people with printed stuff if they need it. So we'll get all that stuff to them. And yeah, we really try to encourage people to not use face-to-face contact to like outreach people, but we're kind of acknowledging the fact that we can't control people. So we also give guidelines. Okay, if you're going to knock on a door, like wear a mask, wash your hands, wear gloves, stand like 6 or 7 or 8 feet back, print out something that just has like the information so that you can just, you don't have to like yell or whatever. They could like see like, okay, email me or text me. So, you know, we don't really have the authority to tell people what to do and what not to do. We can suggest what they should do. So we're trying to give advice in a roundabout way that would allow people to understand what it would mean to do door knocking or something, even though we don't think that we don't think you should do that right now, generally speaking. So that's kind of like the whole process for Tank.
Thank you so much for that. I think there were a couple of things that you mentioned that I would like to hear from Chrysanthi, actually. There was a mention about a guide, and knowing that in LA, there's this campaign called the Food Not Rent campaign that came out of the LA Tenants Union, right? And so also to note that its dues paying membership has doubled, right? You would think that it wouldn't, but it has. And so there's, you know, membership is increasing. There's this guide that's being used. Like, how are we adapting in LA? What are some of the things that you see, you know, that are happening also like in Philadelphia, Bay Area, Burlington, but what are things that might be a little bit different that we're doing here in LA?
Yeah, definitely. And it's also really inspiring to hear from Justin and from Mata of like the different ways people are going about it. I'm thinking we should be doing more propaganda, like you've said, and doing more poster making, which actually Cesar's been involved with for LA Tenants Union. Yeah, the Food Not Rent campaign. So when the crisis started, we started getting inundated with emails of people asking, how can you support us if we choose not to pay our rent? So that's been an interesting moment of the people themselves asking this, and us being ready to support this, and also of course our own membership asking it as well. So what the Food Not Rent campaign is save your rent money for food and medicine. We don't know how long this crisis is going to last. And, you know, one thing that we have a lawyer that always says that there are 33 eviction court judges in Los Angeles. If everybody fought their eviction, we would flood the court system. So right now we have about 1,000 people who didn't pay rent in April just in Los Angeles. The headline I saw nationally was a third of renters in the United States didn't pay rent. And like Justin was saying, it's very reasonable to ask for rent forgiveness when so many people have lost their jobs. This is a reasonable ask, and we're gonna keep doing it. And of course, those numbers are only going to go up as they go. Their first response was to do outreach, was to call all of our members and check in on them and make sure they know that they can count on us for mutual aid. We don't have anything specifically set up the way Philly does, but we're just responding to individual requests at the moment. And then also definitely putting this information out there, sharing Food Not Rent on social media, sharing it with new members, sharing it with our own members as well. Yeah, there's been a lot of energy. One thing is that we were hearing was the symbol of the white sheet. People were putting white sheets across the United States. People were doing this. Well, we thought, does everybody have a white sheet? What if you put a grocery bag on your door? Because you're saying that I'm choosing food, not rent. And what's a cool little story about that is we have one new member who flyered his whole building, and there was one unit, nobody answered, so he left the information. The next day he saw there was a bag on the door. So now he's like been in contact with that person. So it's interesting during this time, even just leaving that flyer on that door, not even having that communication, we can still find ways to be connected. And of course, that is a symbol that people can take pictures of and post on social media and spread the word that way as well. But yeah, definitely to echo what Mara was saying, we had just had this conversation last night that we have to do more outreach to our Spanish speaking tenants. We have to bridge this tech divide. All of our meetings are on Zoom. Yes, there's a call-in number. Yes, we've been texting our members and letting them know, but we need to do more. And our meetings have always been bilingual, and we have a language justice committee that does simultaneous interpretation using equipment. And it's a very different process on Zoom. Instead, you have people, if the meeting is in English, people who are listening in Spanish are on one line, and they're kind of they're sequestered on that line. They can still communicate through the interpreter, but so we're talking about our next meeting or the meeting after that being in Spanish and doing a lot of specific outreach, because we're gonna lose as a movement if we're losing the people that live in the city. And we have to do more flyering. Like I said, we need to put more posters out there. We need to do Know Your Rights videos in Spanish. So that was like that was the thing that came out of last night's meeting of the Vermont Beverly chapter. Hopefully that answered your question, right? Yeah.
Definitely, it gave a lot of good context, and I think it's really important to talk about the different language barriers, how it impacts the type of organizing we're doing, right? And if we're trying to say that, we're a union that represents, the masses of people or whatever, then it has to come from the people who are most impacted, right? And I think like in the beginning, I mentioned that there's this saying that we got from our Latin American comrades who say that we're not organizing the people, this is the people organized, right? So instead of seeing ourselves as separate from this struggle, we're seeing it as like, this is our struggle, and this is us, organizing ourselves to change our conditions, right? But also like, who are the people who are involved in this, struggle alongside us, right? And how are we actually bringing those folks in? So thank you for that. To move over to Patrick in Burlington, what are some of the ways that you guys are all adapting in Burlington, right? Seeing as how it's a smaller space, do you think that that's actually making it easier, or do you think it doesn't really have like that much of an effect either way?
Well, Burlington, like most other cities, is economically segregated. So the neighborhood for us where most working class Burlingtonians live, the ones that haven't been pushed out through gentrification, is the Old North End. And so you have you have a lot of slumlords up there. One example is Bissonnette, which is a large landlord, over the past couple of years has evicted almost 300 people from their Section 8 housing under the auspices of capital improvements. So it's a classic, fully legal way to kick people out and raise the rents. In the context of the current crisis, we're hearing a lot of desperation when people reach out to us via email. We have a hotline that people can call for support. People are really scared, not only of everything that's going on with the coronavirus, but also the kind of things they've been hearing from their landlords. Landlords saying, you should, if you can't pay, you should be looking into homeless shelters. We're going to kick you out. I don't care what the city hall says. If you don't pay rent, you don't belong here. A lot of intimidation that's going on. And sometimes under saccharine words too, like, very passive aggressive. You can tell that, they're being nice, but they're also, they're conveying, they're expressing their power as the landlord over you. We are lucky in that we did do quite a bit of in-person organizing, flyering, agitation, public activity in the past year. So we have a bit of a head start. We have a bit of public recognition. People know who we are. Last year, our developer mayor put on a pair of housing summits, which was addressed the housing crisis in the city. And of course, no surprise to anybody on this call, the big push was just to increase supply by reducing regulations on landlords and developers. So no tenants were represented. We put together a counter summit, a Burlington Tenant Summit, which was very well attended, hundreds of people. And it was at that event that we really started in earnest doing the kind of data collection that we're now taking advantage of right now. And I think, as other speakers have mentioned, data is key right now. We put on a large Zoom call a while back that was specifically about what's going on with renters during the coronavirus crisis. The survey answers we got, that we asked info on their location, who their landlord is, but also asked, how many months of rent could you afford to pay, as of this point? Would you be willing to entertain the idea of a rent strike or a rent withholding? I would say, looking at the data this afternoon, in prep for this call, a majority of people wrote 0 for the number of months that they could afford rent. And almost 100% said yes, they'd be willing to, consider a rent strike and a rent withholding. So this desperation is also turning into agitation. It's turning into confidence. When people are backed up against the wall with little to lose, they're willing to try something big, especially if they know that other people have their back. So we've been, of course, using Zoom and Google Hangouts and other conference call techniques to connect people, to do one-on-ones with new members or people who are calling in to express interest, so we can sit down with them virtually, talk them through their rights, connect them to resources, both in terms of the here and now, getting food and keeping the lights on and things like that, but also legal aid if they're threatening, if the landlord's threatening them with legal papers. We also hold those calls for general meetings, working groups. We've got a rent strike working group meeting going on just tomorrow. So we've been able to really build on the in-person stuff we've been doing. We haven't been doing a ton of it right now, as you can imagine. But certainly, in the past year, being in a fairly compressed area, it has been really useful. One of the things that we did after we collected the survey data was, because people gave their addresses, we were able to upload this into a private mapping system where we could actually look at not only who is where, but also who the landlords are and where this geospatial concentration is. So that's not as helpful right now because everybody's remote. We don't want people talking to each other face to face. But as we emerge from this, this is going to be useful in building out where are centers of power. Where can we not only build against landlords, but then also start to think about block associations, about neighborhood councils, neighborhood assemblies, finding new ways to organize people who are systemically exploited in a common means.
Thank you so much for that. It seems like there's so much creativity happening right now in this present moment, right? And this kind of brings us to our last question, kind of critiquing the idea of the present moment, right? And so for those of you at home or at work or wherever you're watching this, right, we got to very quickly skim over a piece that kind of talked a little bit about this. And so the question is kind of tailored around that. So just for context, right? This week I had the chance to read a recently published article on organizing.org by Marianne Garneau. She's a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, and the piece is titled "The Myth of the Present Moment," right? And so in it, Garneau argues that organizing isn't any easier in ripe historical conditions. So to add, she says, the present moment is no reason to throw our hard-earned lessons about building power out the window. Exceptional approaches to organizing based on some notion that the usual realities have been suspended are irresponsible and bad, right? So it's a sober reminder that there are no shortcuts in organizing, and seeing how much work you all put into base building. I want to know, what are your thoughts on the state of tenant organizing in general, right? Like, what are the things that we've won? What are the things that we've yet to win, right? And so I would like Mara to be the one to be able to answer this question, if you would like.
Thank you for passing the mic. um, so, I mean, in theory, in general, I agree. I haven't read the whole article. I did hear about it, and I'm curious. We'll probably go and read it after this. But reading the quote on here, I do agree on principle, right? That we shouldn't, all the lessons that we have learned, we shouldn't just toss them out the window. Obviously, this is when those lessons are actually, this is that time to put them, through. I do agree that there's gears change a little bit when it's the right moment or when things are agitating. Because usually when things are not happening like it's happening right now in a normal situation, we are the agitators, right? We are the ones going and they're like, hey, like, you landlord, it's like, doesn't it suck that you have to pay rent? But now it's the opposite. Now people are coming to us and they're like, hey, I have to pay rent. What do I do? Like, and it's different because now it's more like you're catching rather than you going and getting, so the gears do switch a little bit. And it's not saying, the way that I tell people that I coach or people that I have been working with is that this is the time that we have been preparing for, right? All the time that we go out and like all the one-on-ones that we have been doing, all the base building, all the relationships that we have been building, all the things that we have done together for so many years. These are the times that we have been preparing for, right? So the things do change a little bit, and tactics are the same, but you have to be creative. But all the things that I feel that this is the time that we have been preparing for. I don't know if that answers the question. Like what else are we like organizing all the time if it's not for the time that it's ready, when we're ready, when the time is right to kind of like push for more kind of like wins, and I mean that's just how I see it. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really enjoy the fact that, like, when you sent us your bio, right, one of the main words that was on there was base builder. And to me, that's always like, it makes sense, right? You need to build a base to be able to do any of the action and the work that you need done, right? And I think this piece kind of speaks to that things don't just happen magically just because the moment is different. And in the article, Garneau talks about how in your traditional labor organizing, you have what are called hot shops, right? And so sometimes, a lot of the times actually, hot shops make it very difficult to be able to do long-lasting, long-term base building, right? And so I think you definitely speak a lot to that, and I appreciate you being able to say all those things and reminding us about why it's important to think long-term, right? So thank you for that. I would like to go to Justin. What do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a really salient question. And I think it's like relevance is linked to the kind of like political terrain that we see right now, where there are some people who see this moment and they're like, okay, now's the time to do this like massive rent strike and kind of like throw the usual tools and mechanisms and organizing processes to the wind and kind of like rush headfirst into it, which I appreciate the spirit. But just as someone who's like been organizing, I'm like, okay, well, let's do that. And let's also, in addition to that, like build some real organization and some real capacity and trust between tenants, between working class people, because ultimately when push comes to shove and we're faced with like, you know, the ferociousness of the state, of like the organized landlords or whatever, it's organization that is going to be able to bring us through to any kind of victory or whatever. I think the other thing that's important too is that, like, you know, in the way that I personally, so just speaking for myself, have thought about this and in my like organizing with Tank, and I think this is a distinction with some local tenant organizing groups here that are not Tank. For me, the most important thing about this moment, you know, unless something magical happens and capitalism ends because of COVID-19, which I hope is true, but, you know, being kind of a little more, I'll just say pessimistic, the thing that I hope to come out of this moment with is like higher density of organizational strength, higher levels of class consciousness, people who are prepared to defend themselves and their neighbors on a level never seen before, right? For me, that's the best case scenario that we come out of this with. Maybe some people will also save on rent in the meantime, but, you know, just thinking in the long term, that's the strategy. That's the thing that matters the most. And so we've been really in Tank trying to not throw our strategy to the wind, but actually use this moment and understand it as an intensification of all those contradictions that have been there ever since. And so I really agree with Mara in that I don't think it's totally right to disregard the exceptionality of this moment. I think it's clearly exceptional. Like Tank membership has quadrupled. We have new locals. People are interested and excited and willing to take risks that previously they weren't. So there's something special about the moment. But the real task, I think, is to take that specialness and integrate it into your strategy for building durable working class organization, producing class consciousness, getting people sort of ready to be in the tenant movement for the long term. And so, you know, like we have been making some adjustments to be able to, you know, really be relevant in this moment. So one thing that we've been doing is that we weren't doing previously is open organizing office hours, where any tenant, regardless of you being a Tank member or not, can drop in and just chat with people who have been tenant organizing about whatever issue you're having. It could be that you haven't started yet and you're scared to knock on doors or slip notes under the door or whatever. It could be that you're a superstar, you've already organized your building, but now what? Like whatever it is, you know, these are the sort of practical problems people are running into. And so, and a lot of people are running into because of the moment. And so we've added that as like a sort of into our repertoire of, you know, ways to address the situation. So yeah, in general, I think it requires a tactical adjustment. And I think it's really good to embrace the radicalism and the desire and the passion that people have. And, you know, at the same time, I think it's really for us, at least, about harnessing that and building that into the strategy of, you know, class organization, tenant organization, building out the tenant union, and coming out of this being able to punch above our current weight class or whatever.
Thank you for that. Really appreciate the response. I would actually like to hear from Chrysanthi now, specifically because we were both on the same tenant call for our local, right? And when people were talking about the rent strike, there were some very well-known like voices within that group that actually were kind of, you know, I guess weary of calling for a rent strike, right? And their reasoning was that, you know, we have, you know, this certain membership, right? We have a membership of, you know, however many people, but how many people are actually willing to go on rent strike, and what does that mean to go on rent strike, right? And so I think there's like a lot that there is to learn from just that conversation itself, right? And I want to see if Chrysanthi can help frame that in the way that I'm envisioning it. So if you can read my mind, I'd like to hear from you.
I got you. Yeah, so yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, because there's different schools of thought, and we have lawyers who are members of our organization. And one of the lawyer who had said the thing I mentioned earlier about the eviction court judges was advising tenants to make up a payment plan for their rent and for all of their bills, and try as hard as you can to pay rent, or try as hard as you can to save it to pay it later. And we said, yes, according to the laws that we've been given, that is advice, that is legal advice to be given. But we're not going to wait for lawyers in responding to people who are saying, I don't have that money now. And we think it's a violence to ask people to save money for rent that they do need for food or medicine. So yeah, it's been interesting navigating different schools of thought, whether that was people advising, hey, you should pay partial rent if you can, even $100, versus people saying, why would you, that $100 could still go for food and medicine and resources. And once again, it's like the quote that you mentioned, Cesar, like the people have decided, people know what they are capable of. And also we've had people interested in striking in solidarity with people in their building. Maybe they've kept their jobs or still are getting paid. They have the capacity, but understanding and recognizing that there's greater power in solidarity. Yeah, I mean, definitely in terms of the hot shop analogy, I would say I have seen it's been so interesting the way that this just radicalized people from the beginning, because people will say, oh, I've already talked to neighbors in my building, but there's 30 of us, but only 10 of us want to form a tenant association. Oh man. And we're like, that's amazing. Like that's wonderful. You've done that in like a week or two. It's been interesting also, like navigating expectations of people who hadn't been plugged into our organization, but are just recognized for themselves and for their neighbors that this crisis demands that kind of response. And we're telling people, yeah, they don't want to form it, but we're here as a resource. So let them know, those people, if they can't pay in May, or if they're having an issue, that they can come to you. And because once again, like these relationships are built slowly. I mean, when the crisis, they could be accelerated. But yeah, meeting people where they're at, I'll keep emphasizing that. And then also the fact that these buildings have tenant associations now. We had a campaign, like a TA in every building. That would be, and this is something that if there's an earthquake, people can check in on each other. Mutual aid, it doesn't have to be specifically around tenant concerns, looking out for each other, building that community. So those structures, we want them to exist after, who knows when the crisis will end, but after that. So yeah, definitely we're in an extraordinary moment. We're calling for total rent forgiveness right now. And yeah, I've just been thinking, like, if we win, what does that tell people about rent? If the state or the system can just erase it like that, what does that tell us going forward? And I think we can see so many examples outside of housing too, like where insulin is now at $35, or cities are putting vulnerable unhoused folks in hotels. Like, when the crisis ends, what will we accept things the way we are? And obviously people on this live stream understand that we will not. And so I think that's an extraordinary moment. If we lose, let's think of the worst case scenario, like LA hires more judges and they give people a year to pay it back, and people cannot pay it back, and they start doing these mass evictions. I mean, in January, we had been talking about doing more eviction blockades, doing more civil disobedience. We had an eviction blockade training with 125 people, and those people are all in a database right now. But yeah, we will fight you. We will fight you. We will expose this contradiction of thinking working class people are expendable. So I think that, yeah, we're in a quite a unique moment, and we have a lot of power. And then the last thing I want to shout out is this incredible national and continental network of tenants unions, the Autonomous Tenants Union Network. So this has been going on for about a year, my understanding, I'm not sure. And there was, you know, it was building, there was plans for a convention of tenants unions across US and Canada happening in the fall. We'll see if that happens, but things are moving much more rapidly. I think in the next couple weeks, you'll start seeing the presence of that as we build a website, as we do more outreach. And, you know, in California and Los Angeles, we have some protections, and being on the call, hearing from people in Omaha, Nebraska, where their eviction court's still open, people are still getting forced out of their homes during a crisis. I'm really grateful to the LA Tenants Union members who were on, they had office hours this week for the Autonomous Tenants Union Network, and got calls from all over the United States. So definitely thinking like building this into a continental movement, and then linking in with there's a network, a worldwide network as well. So building that, starting with our building blocks, starting with our cities, and building it into something bigger is exciting.
Thank you so much for that. Just to be cognizant of time, we have a certain amount of time scheduled on the Zoom webinar, right? We don't know if it's going to kick us out if we don't extend the time. It might. So if that happens, then we'll just relaunch it again and see if folks can get on. And if you can't get on, then you could just check it out on the Black Rose YouTube, where I know some people are watching it right now, right? So just so a heads up. Also, I know that Mara has to step off at some point soon. And I just want to thank you so much for having been on this panel. Like, a lot of what you're saying resonates, and just a lot of good, a lot of good things to take in, right? And so I want to say that to you before, you know, this panel probably collapses and we all disappear into nothingness. But that being said, I would like to hear from Patrick now in Burlington, Vermont.
Sure. Chrysanthi, to your point about the lawyers, I've long suggested that we keep lawyers out of strategy discussions because they have a very specific skill set, right? And the skill set is keeping you out of jail as long as possible. But God, they can be really horrible strategists and tacticians. And we actually early on in organizing, we even here at BTU, we've had issues around that. They can be a conservatizing force. So to the organizing.work piece, I think it's a fair point. I don't know if it fully applies to this situation though, because there's a question of the moment itself, and then there's the question of the underlying material conditions, which we absolutely have to take into account. Sometimes you end up with a hot shop kind of scenario where the material conditions actually haven't changed. One of the examples I like to give is, folks may have heard of it. It was this social justice encampment in New York City in 2011, where people were like railing against inequality. You may have heard of it. It's called Bloombergville. Actually, nobody's heard of it because it totally petered out. It was a valiant effort. Incredible organizers came behind it, but they didn't, it didn't catch fire like something did, a couple months later in September when Occupy Wall Street kicked off. So I think that's sort of like a hot shop kind of question. Okay, there's these moments where things really take off. There's really no way to predict in advance, but that happens. This current crisis feels different though. It feels like the material conditions have changed. People have lost their jobs. People are getting physically kicked out. So I think in this sense, we do need to adjust our organizing tactics. We have to take this into account. You know, a lot of neighbors we're hearing are talking to each other for the first time. So renters in the same building, next door neighbors, even just check in, see how you're doing, check in on, you know, an elderly neighbor to make sure they have everything they need. That sort of, you know, bubbling up of sort of natural mutual aid. That's the beginning of a lot of organizing conversations. So I think the task for us, when we're, you know, we're all getting flooded with interest, with calls, with emails, people who really want to take action and they're not quite sure what to do. Our task is to bring them in and plug them into useful work. One of the things, you know, we added to our survey that we sent out for people who are attending the events, both online and offline in general, is, you know, what are skills that you can share? What are you an expert in? What can you do really well that you'd be willing to bring to either the group or group members who are in need? And so we're absolutely tapping that and looking that up to see where people can be useful in the time when, you know, a lot of us are just stuck at home and we're not sure what to do. So if we can, you know, how do we make it irresistible to both join organizations like Tenants Unions and other political groups, and then remain a member too? And just real quick, the court question is important. Here in Burlington, it's anywhere between a 2 to 3 to maybe even a 6-month legal process to evict someone. If we get a flood of evictions due to non-payment afterward, that could easily be a year or more. A lot of people, you know, the number one concern we're getting from people who are interested in withholding rent, organizing with their tenants against their landlords is, you know, they're afraid of being alone against the landlord. And that's very reasonable. And a big part of our outreach has to be showing people our theory of change, that yes, if one tenant withholds their rent at any point, they're probably going to get evicted. But if all the tenants withhold their rent, that's an entirely different situation. Then that's the beginning of a negotiation. And it's the same kind of vibe that you get when you're organizing a workplace too. One person asks for a raise, they can get fired. If everybody asks for a raise, then that's the beginning of a negotiation. That's where you can actually build a campaign and you can win. So we've been trying to drive that home with people, that, you know, you're not alone. Let's walk through, here's what could happen and what, you know, what likely will happen. So it's not a big, scary question mark in the future. And then, you know, when push comes to shove, you know, we're trying to build up, you know, both the will and the resources to support people if they do get kicked out one way or another. Yeah, we're going to do eviction blockades as need be. We're going to bring in trainers to help us do that well. There's some great people in Boston who have done that, especially during the housing crisis last time. And yeah, I think we need to reassure people that yes, their initial instinct to say screw the landlord is fundamentally a correct one, and let's help you screw your landlord.
Thank you so much for that, Patrick. We are at 1:30 p.m. here on Pacific Standard Time, and we're still on this call, so it didn't shut down. But who knows, right? But before that happens, I know Mara wanted to say a little something before they got off. So it's all yours, Mara.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me over. It's super great to hear what is going on in Burlington, in Los Angeles, and with Justin, which I'm not sure. What I wanted to say was that, oh yeah, so I think that the whole, I just wanted to put a message out there for like, look, for people who are like listening, if you have like a tenants union in your city, Google it, find them on Facebook, you know, join them, send them a message. I'm sure that they will listen to whatever's going on with you, and they will help you out. Two, I think that if you're able to pay your rent, but you want to be part of this like movement, think of ways that you could, instead of paying your rent, you can in solidarity like withhold, and instead of like getting yourself a new pair of shoes, maybe think about donating this money to your local tenants union. Just saying. And also, and number three, know that you're not alone. All you have to do is like go and like, sometimes it's a little embarrassing to admit that you have issues paying with the rent and stuff like that. But like, look, everybody's going through this. And if you don't speak up, the next person who's sitting next to you, who's also probably feeling embarrassed, will never know that there's somebody else feeling the same way. And there's no shame in not being able to afford your rent or anything like that, because literally that's extortion. I see it as extortion. It's like, if I don't pay my rent, then it means that I'm going to be in the streets. You know, it's like, it's violence, you know, and nobody should be put in that situation. And lastly, I don't follow any kind of, I don't think I consider myself any like a Leninist or anything like that. But Lenin did say something around the lines like, there's like, you know, years where days happen, and then there's like weeks where years happen, or something like that. And I think we're in a situation like that right now. And if you're somebody who, you know, have been thinking about starting like an organization, a tenants organization or something like that, always know that I mean, right now is a good time, because right now you don't have, I mean, it's difficult. It's gonna be probably harder than it would have been before, but you know, people are willing, are listening, and they need answers. You know, people are scared, and this is when we come in with, like, you know, our values, and it's like, look, I think it's fucked up, and we should do something about it, and think about the long term. If you're gonna do the rent strike, think about how that's going to, how you can use that as a weapon, as a tool to get long term results. You know, yeah, that's it. Thank you so much, and I'll see you everybody. Bye. Felices Pascuas.
Thank you so much, Chao. So we are at the Q&A section of our panel. And to help me out with that is actually my producer, the big head in the sky right now. And if they would like to introduce themselves, they can.
Hey everyone, my name's Cameron. I'm also a Black Rose member in the Bay Area, and with the help of a lot of other Black Rose folks and the folks that you've seen on your screen here today, we put together this live stream, which is our first as an organization, and I think it's gone really well. So I'm excited that this is happening, and I'm excited to have been part of it. But yeah, we had about 100 people, more than 100 people register for the Zoom event. And in that registration, some people asked questions. So we've touched on the main questions that we wanted to ask internally. And now I'm going to ask a couple questions that folks at home sent in and wanted to get out there. So I'm gonna go ahead and ask the first one. It's kind of a big one, but I think it's a good question to consider, given what personally I've seen is sort of this emergence of rank and file style tenant organizing versus a more classic style of tenant organizing, or tenant organizing that's focused on NGO or 501c3 legalistic organizing. So in the recent past, we've seen the reemergence or the emergence of tenant unions like LATU, like Tank, like Burlington Tenants Union, like Philly Tenants Union, that are focused on rank and file style organizing. So this question gets to the heart of that, I think, and I'm going to go ahead and ask it. So Marcos asks, how can we steer classic policy forward tenant organizing toward an approach that aims for more than tenant law reform? So the pretty broad ending there, but I think it speaks to this emergence of a new style or reinvigorated militant rank and file style organizing. So I'll hand it over to Justin first, if you want to take up that question or expound on that a little bit. It's up to you.
Yeah, so, you know, I don't have experience steering an already existing group that is focused on questions of like legal advocacy or advice in that sort of direction. So part of the terrain of struggle or whatever, part of the situation here in the Bay is that we have an abundance of those kinds of organizations. Quite a few organizations that provide legal aid, counseling, organizations that are sort of more policy minded. We even have one organization that's pretty popular called ACE, which even does some tenant organizing, but is still really focused on sort of building a kind of more classic nonprofit organization style group up, and sort of trying to make alliances with, like, you know, smaller landlords, for example, or policy stakeholders and stuff like this. So there's like a wide landscape here of ostensibly progressive and oftentimes very helpful organizations. Our decision was to build our own independent organization. And the reason for that was born of some experience that some of us have had sort of being inside already existing groups, and the real difficulty and institutional inertia that exists in a lot of these groups is very strong. Especially, you know, groups that are well established, have a reputation, have staff already that are paid. It's very, very difficult to move those groups. And so my personal view is that it's just in terms of how much you're going to get out of the amount of work you put in. It's probably worth just establishing a new organization. That's my personal opinion here. It's really hard to start a new organization. You know, Tank started in 2018 approximately, and it's taken time to like get our bearings and figure out how it all works. But I think we've hit a point now where a lot of us who were kind of like forcing it to happen are able to be negligent, and the whole thing still goes, which is a great sign. And so, you know, it's possible, anyone can do it. There's lots of lessons to be learned from people who have started new groups. And I would tell anyone anywhere who is dwelling over this question to seriously consider how difficult it is to change the culture, the structure, the politics of a group that already exists. I think it's very, very difficult, and it may not be worth your time. That's my personal opinion.
Thanks so much for that. I'm going to turn it over to Chrysanthi now, if you have thoughts on this same question.
Yeah, definitely. That comes up. We've had discussions of how do we make sure we're building a movement and not just providing services and finding ourselves in the same service models as nonprofits. And it kind of came up during this crisis as well. So one thing that we thought, we noticed as people were asking us for a letter template, and what we've been doing is keeping track and letting people know that you're going to be part of this movement. On that letter, it says, if you have any issues with this, contact your LATU representative. So landlords will see our letterhead and they will know that, and maybe they'll get it from other tenants as well, or maybe they just get it from one, but it goes back to what Patrick was saying is that making sure people understand they're not doing this individually and plugging them into a widespread movement. And but what we've seen is nonprofits have a very similar letter template, but it's just there as a resource, and it doesn't suggest that they're going to advocate for them. It just says, hey, here's a letter template and you're going to have to pay that rent back in 12 months. So that's that political understanding that we can push for rent forgiveness, we can push for negotiation. That's lacking in a lot of these organizations, and that's why the LA Tenants Union formed. And another thing, I guess the only other thought was that we've put like when we form tenant associations, we say what you can do is you can now that you've formed your tenant association, we ask that, you know, one of your members continues to attend our meetings, continues to update it so we can support you. And that's worked out very well. Like that's included in the bylaws as well. And it's, yeah, because we're here to support you in forming that tenant association. If tenants didn't want to continue with us, then, and they still had that tenant association, that's a choice. But we're saying that part of that, part of us helping you and organizing with you is also hearing, we want your voice in our meetings and in our organizing strategies as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And then we're going to turn over to Patrick for his thoughts on the same thing.
Yeah, I would generally dovetail with what Justin said. It's really hard to change the DNA of an organization once it's really off the ground. And there will always be an easy drive toward the NGOization of directly democratic working class institutions. Just it's part of the terrain. And I don't want to speak out of turn because I don't know a ton of the details, but my understanding is something similar happened in Portland, Oregon, where you had what was originally something that was very directly democratic, working class based in tenants, and then slowly got shifted to what's more like a lobbying organization, where you have people, who are well employed, the nonprofit industrial complex, taking the organization over, taking control of the website, the social media, sort of the slow accretion of power to a few people. And next thing you know, it's not actually organized, with and for tenants themselves. It builds these kinds of cross-class coalitions that they love. So really detrimental to what we're going after. And that's what, especially for people who are listening, who are thinking about starting a tenants organization and a tenants union, I would strongly urge you against just getting a bunch of your leftist friends together in a room and calling yourselves a tenants union. Just like a couple leftists at work do not a union make. You need to actually create a mass level organization where people will join regardless of politics, more or less. We can have some litmus tests here, but generally speaking, the one criteria should be that you're a renter in this prescribed area, and you should be building out the base of the organization at the apartment level. So we need to be organizing against specific landlords as a very start. Pushing things at a community level can be good for outreach. It can be good for publicity to make sure people are aware. But organizing mostly at the city level is difficult, and it's dangerous because it does push you toward that more lobbying approach. Well, if we're doing something city level, I guess we better start talking to city councilors. We should work on legislation, maybe. Let's start getting into the palace intrigue of city politics instead of actually focusing where the power is. So there will be, a constellation of organizations. There, like Justin said, there are some very useful nonprofits out there that can support individual tenants who are going through crisis, who are having, problems. Let them do that. There are groups, in Burlington who do the same thing. That's fine for their role. That's not our job, though. Our job is to, work as a class and build class power. And that's the only way we're going to do that through housing is through tenants unions. So I would say don't be afraid to build something from the ground up if something that you see existing doesn't really fit the bill.
Thanks so much for that, Patrick. So I'm going to ask one last question that we got from some folks, and then I'm going to hand it back to Cesar, and we're going to let everyone give a chance to give final thoughts, and then Cesar is going to give sort of the closeout speech here. But before we do that, I want to ask, for folks that are tuning into this is their first time sort of interacting with any kind of any of the questions around tenant organizing. Maybe they don't have a tenant organizing group in their neighborhood or in their city. Maybe they, are interested, given the present situation, in doing tenant organizing because they can't pay their rent. What would you tell someone what's one takeaway that you would give someone? Where should they start if they are interested in beginning doing tenant organizing, maybe in a place where there is no current tenant union or tenant organization? What's the first step? And I'm going to hand it over to Justin to give this a thought.
Yeah, I feel pretty strongly that if you're in that kind of situation, you feel compelled by the moment, or maybe you're directly affected, or maybe both. It seems to me that it's always best to start from where you are as a sort of working class person, assess your surroundings. The last thing you ever want to do is see yourself as someone who's above or outside of this like whole condition, right? And so for most people, that means that you rent from someone and you have a landlord who most likely has other renters. So you should probably talk to them. And it doesn't have to be that big of a jump, you don't need to go to them and say, okay, hey, my name is whatever. Are you ready for a rent strike or whatever? You could just be like, hey, I want to start like a group chat so we can support each other and make sure we're safe. just even something as simple as that, and as common sense as that, is a like really material first step that anyone can take, and that is accessible to anybody of any skill level, whatever. And so, yeah, I think, you know, or if you're a group of people who are interested, the same goes. Like, assess your surroundings, assess your own situations, do some self-inquiry. A lot of us, a big problem with the left, I think in general, is we tend to like see the class struggle as this thing that we're kind of observing and commenting on or whatever. But the time, I think, for us to finally assess the situation as one that we are in is now. And so that would be my advice.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin. I'm actually going to ask Cesar the same question because they had an interesting sort of method for beginning to talk to some of their neighbors where they live. I remember you mentioning at one point in a conversation we had, there was a time when the power went out on your block, and you maybe talk about how you use that as a in for starting to do tenant organizing.
So yeah, so for us here, there was a time when there was a transformer in the back that just blew up, and it caused the whole street to lose power for probably 3 days, right? So some of our food in the fridge went bad, but initially it was like very windy conditions for LA, right? Enough that it caused this thing to blow up. And so a couple of us, you know, just walked back there and saw what was happening because it blew up a second time. And at first we were kind of just like, whoa, this is, you know, what's happening, you know? But kind of through that, we started, you know, just talking to each other about like, hey, like, what do we do now? Like, what happens like if it's like an earthquake or something? What happens if there's a fire? Like, do we know what is the protocol for us as, you know, as neighbors? Like, how do we get together, right? And from that, we kind of started talking to each other about some of the issues that were happening in our building, right? Some of them having to do with like, we're not allowed to leave certain things outside of the apartment building, or other things having to do with, you know, just getting things fixed in the building, right? And so I think from that, we were able to talk to a small handful of tenants here in the building, right? And from that, nothing really materialized. Like, you know, it didn't magically just make everyone feel like, okay, now we're part of the Tenants Union and we're doing this and it's not whatever, right? Like, it just kind of got us to be able to open up to each other and be able to say hi to each other, right? And so that was approximately like a year ago. And from then it's also like the issue of like the hot shop, right? Like it's easy to get people quote unquote on board when there's like some type of emergency, some type of disaster, some type of firing happening in a workplace, right? But that doesn't always translate to commitment, right? And so on the other hand, it's kind of just like when there isn't necessarily like a huge emergency happening, sometimes people don't see that as like I don't know, like you don't stop to think that like, oh, maybe I should organize, and maybe it's about changing the social relationship and the dynamics in my home, right? But with everything that just happened, you know, last month, right? This gave us the opportunity to kind of reactivate that small network of folks and to add more people into that network of folks. And so now, you know, we've been able to talk to each other a little bit more. And actually, like, I had people sending me stuff about the Food Not Rent campaign and things of that sort. And so I think that's really interesting how, like, if you build it, they will come, essentially, right? It's like, even though your organization may not be like doing all this stuff, right? When you have that visibility, like, people know who to reach out to and people know where to look towards for like that guidance, right? And that's when you could bring people in and say, okay, this is you know, what's happening to us. So how are we collectively gonna change those things? So I'm not sure if that completely answers what you're asking, But that's just kind of like where we're at right now. And hopefully some of my neighbors are watching or hearing me through the walls, because they signed up and stuff. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So we're going to go to Patrick, and I'm going to ask the same question. What's your advice? What would be one takeaway you'd give to someone who is completely new to this, is facing the present circumstances? Maybe they're, worrying about their ability to pay rent, but they're interested in doing tenant organizing, but they don't know where to start. What's the first step that you would advise them to do?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. You need to start where you are. Start with your own landlord. Start with the landlord of you and your friends and coworkers, the people around you. That's where you have to start. And it start by reading all the guides that you've seen, both present and past. I mean, tenants have been organizing since there have been tenants, so they're not only lessons to be learned from what our unions have been putting out in the past couple of weeks, but also from 100 years ago. So try and steep yourself in. And this doesn't make you a good organizer by any stretch, but what it hopefully does is helps you avoid some key mistakes that people before you have made, right? So you can start with at least a base level of understanding of how these things usually work, common pitfalls, and then I would also recommend document what you're doing. And I know some of the unions on this call have been doing an excellent job in terms of not only describing sort of their history, but also day to day, campaign to campaign, what went right, what went wrong, not just the victories, but also the failures, because everybody else is reading that. And when they need to try this, they'll become better equipped to do so. So especially when you're starting from scratch, that's where we all start at some point. Keep a log, either it's video or you're writing blog posts or social media feed, whatever, to keep track of what happened and be able to tell the story to others. Lessons learned, even if it fails spectacularly, the lesson that you learn from that could, keep another, effort either in your town in the future or somewhere else entirely from failing along the same lines.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Now we're going to hand it over to Chrysanthi to answer that same question about where to start. And then once Chrysanthi is finished giving their answer, we'll hand it back over to Cesar to sort of give closing thoughts, and then everyone can go around and give closing thoughts.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. I think that that's what we recommend. That's like the first step of forming a tenant association, is get on a group text chat or some sort of way of communicating with each other. And I think it would be very similar, like Justin said. I think what Cesar said about talking to your neighbors first and first mostly, that's really important. What Patrick said about documenting and just starting a social media account. And so the thing that I'll just add is that since we've built this, I haven't been as involved, but people have been building this autonomous tenants union network. We would love to support people like you, and there are even office hours. So it's the Autonomous Tenants Union Network. It's atuntenants@gmail.com, and the goal is to have regular office hours, and people answer questions from people who are in all sorts of different cities that didn't have tenant unions, and that happened this week and is going to keep happening. So even if there are not people in your location, there is a nationwide continental support system as well.
Thank you so much for everyone giving their thoughts. I want to open it up to see if people want to give very brief, final thoughts. It is almost 2:00 here, Pacific Standard Time. And I want to be able to get everyone to share a little bit of something, but also being cognizant of time, right? And so I guess we can start with Chrysanthi. Do you have any last final thoughts to share?
I think that I think we're in an extraordinary moment, like I said, of a third of people who didn't pay rent in April, and there's a lot of energy happening, and we've had the the foundation of being around for 5 years, but there's even going to be a lot of energy for people just starting now. And would love to be, if anyone reaches out to Black Rose and would love to, has more follow-up questions, would love to be connected with people as well.
Thank you so much. Let's go with Justin. Any final words?
Yeah, I guess just something else to add. Like this moment is really exceptional and interesting. But you know, I think it's good to be level-headed and to see it as an opportunity to build and grow. And you know, to really put together a movement that has some endurance for the long term. You know, the tasks ahead of us are like monumental, right? We have a really well-organized opposition, not just in the sphere of tenants, but you know, bosses, you know, the sort of capitalist parties, all these sort of like entities that hold alliances with landlords, developers, and speculators is very strong. So we need to make sure that we are able to be clear-eyed about that and build some capacity to push back against them. And so whatever reform comes of this, whatever concession we get, that is just kind of a starting point or a jumping off point. It's not really an end to itself. So I think that's something to keep in mind. If you want more information, you could check out our website, tink.com. I put the link in the chat or whatever. And yeah, our email's on there. Email us and, you know, let's get organized.
Now for Sir Patrick of Burlington, if you would like to give your final words.
Sure. BurlingtonTenantsUnion.com is our website. And then I would just recommend that people keep in mind that during crises and disasters like this, now is not only a time to support each other, but it's also a time where I think a lot of people who normally wouldn't feel like they can give themselves permissions to think audaciously and to think about the world in a different way and how it may be produced in a different way. And so I would, you know, from that perspective, you know, be open to where conversations may go, both when, you know, when you're talking to tenants, but also with people in other political organizations. This is a time that potentially is going to radicalize a lot of people. And if we do our jobs right as organizers, these are people who are going to stay in the movement for the long haul. So I think we should keep an eye out for, you know, really the terrain shifting very quickly beneath our feet in terms of both material conditions, but also what's going on with just popular consciousness around how do we describe what's going on with this crisis? How are we attaching narratives to it? Are these narratives driving us toward complacency and individuality, or are they driving us toward collective action and solidarity? That's, you know, that is a question and a dilemma that I think we can intervene in very successfully in the context of doing this kind of base building organizing.
Thank you so much. So this is just a small glimpse of the hard work that has gone into building a movement of tenants, right? A movement built by the primary actors of struggle in the territorial sector of the US and abroad. So a movement that is building power from below, a movement coming from those, coming for those at the top, right? And now more than ever, it's important that we all recognize the radical potential of our class and recognize that through struggle, we can win. So once again, like a big thank you to our panelists for being here, for taking time out of their day to join us. I'd like to also invite folks for our panel that we're having tomorrow. I won't be moderating it, but another really amazing organizer will be moderating it. It's gonna be a panel with international organizers. It will be also at 12 Pacific Standard Time, 3 Eastern. And if you want to get more information about that, you could always read more at blackrosefed.org. And remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel, as well as all of our social media. And definitely check out From Below Podcast, which is a project from members of Black Rose Rosa Negra. So thank you everyone for tuning in. And a big shout out to Rock Collage for making a really cool loop video that was playing in the beginning. Rock Collage, find him on Instagram. It's really awesome, part of Condina Records. But other than that, that's it. That's our panel. Thank you so much. Arriba las que luchan. Ciao, everyone. Have a good one.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Take it easy.